I'm one of the conservation officers here at Bath and North East Somerset Council, and I've been specifically working on the Green Heritage Homes project as outlined by Sarah at the beginning of this presentation. So taking you into this next module, this is intended to provide an introduction to listed buildings and the listed building consent process specifically, as well as what the process might look like if you're considering making energy efficiency improvements to your building. So next slide, please. So to give a brief overview of what we'll be covering, we'll be looking to provide you with further information on the following topics and ideally leave you with increased confidence going forward to submit your own listed building application. So we'll be looking at what a listed building is, which I'm sure most of you will be aware, but as well as addressing some common misconceptions about what listing means. We'll also go through when you might need listed building consent, as well as what requirements there are for different retrofit measures. And then we'll walk through the process of submitting your listed building application, from what documents you might require, an introduction to local and national policy, so you can have a bit of an understanding of what the policy background to planning is, as well as what the timeline looks like for obtaining consent. We'll also then go into the decision-making process to better understand how the listed building application is assessed by a case officer. Finally, we will then go back and have a look at a recent case study, so the Lansdowne Place East case study, which Joanna covered in the first half, and we'll have a look at that from more of a planning perspective in terms of the case officer's decision, what documents were submitted, and what that process looked like. So if we go on to the next slide. So kicking off here, what is a listed building? So listed buildings are formally defined in the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act 1990 as building or buildings of special architectural or historic interest. Today, Historic England is now responsible for maintaining the list, so the National Register of Listed Buildings across England. Listed buildings are protected in national legislation, and change is managed through the planning system with the input of experienced heritage professionals, such as conservation officers. There are 3 identified levels of listing, so these are ranging from grade 2 star, up to grade 1, and these grade a building's significance against set criteria. So grade 2 listed buildings are the most common form of building, which are characterised as being of special interest, and these make up over 90% of all listed buildings. So for the majority of you, your buildings will likely be grade 2 listed. This is what we'd sort of expect. As we move up the scale of significance, we have grade 2 star buildings, which are characterised as being of more than special interest. And then grade 1 buildings are the most rare, being of exceptional interest, and these alone make up less than 3% of all listed buildings. So as part of a planning decision, the more significant a heritage asset is, greater weight should be given to its conservation. So next slide, please. So there are some common misconceptions about what listing means and what part of a building is protected. So listing does not just apply to a building's exterior. The listing will cover the whole building, including the interior. And I have an example of the David Parr house in Cambridge here, which is grade 2 star listed. And it's sort of a standard Victorian terrace, but it is listed specifically because of its highly decorated arts and crafts interior. Listing descriptions are often simple, and they might not include areas that can't be publicly accessed, so they shouldn't necessarily be taken as a guide to what is listed. Listing can also include any attached or associated pre-1948 buildings or structures, and these are considered to be curtilage listed. So this can include things like outbuildings, garden walls, or associated buildings if you're talking about a complex of buildings such as a farmyard site. And these will be subject to the same planning restrictions as the main building, and changes will require consent. And if you have any doubt about whether your building is considered to be curtilage listed, this can be quite complex, so please get in touch with the conservation officer and they can advise you a bit more on this. Lots of different buildings and structures can be listed, so it doesn't have to be hundreds of years old to be considered to be of merit. So there are lots of examples of 20th century listed buildings across the UK, and one example we have in Bath is Kilowatt House, which is grade 2 listed and was originally built in the 1930s in the Art Deco style as a sound engineering studio. Finally, there are many reasons why a building may be listed, which are not restricted purely to its architectural value or appearance. So a building may be of historic significance where associated with a historic figure or event, and each building's value or significance is unique and requires careful assessment by the homeowner, as previously covered by Joe. So next slide, please. So the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act 1990, which I'll refer to as the Listed Buildings Act, is the key legislation for designation and management. So in accordance with the Act, any works for demolition, alteration or extension in any manner which would affect its character as a building of special architectural or historic interest requires consent. So in practice, this relates to works which should affect building fabric, so alterations or any removal of fabric, or works that would change the building's appearance. Next slide, please. And then moving on to the National Planning Policy Framework, or the NPPF, which sets out the government's planning policies for England and how these should be applied. And this is quite an important document, which is a material consideration in planning decisions. So this sets out that heritage assets can range in their level of significance, are an irreplaceable resource, and should be conserved in a manner appropriate to their significance. Next slide, please. So any alterations to a listed building without consent, or that do not comply with an existing consent or any conditions, will be unauthorised, and this can constitute a criminal offence. Unauthorised works may be pursued by a local authority through enforcement, so this can either be through an enforcement notice for works to be reversed and the building returned to its prior condition, or it can be by requiring an application to be submitted retrospectively to regularise the works. There is no enforcement expiry date for listed buildings, and the existing homeowner will be liable for any unauthorised works, regardless of when these were carried out. And in really extreme cases, there may be an option for the local authority to prosecute with fines. So this is an example of the Punch Bowl in Lancashire, which was demolished without permission, and the owners were found guilty and required to pay a £20,000 fine, as well as being ordered to rebuild the pub to its original plan. So it's sort of just emphasising that it's really important to know what works you can do and make sure you've got the consents. Next slide, please. So, however, it is really important to remember that the planning system isn't intended to prevent change, but it's more about sensitively managing change to listed buildings in order to retain their special interest. So, Historic England really helpfully summarises planning as being the mechanism for assessing proposals and managing change effectively. So the objective is really for heritage assets to be conserved in a manner appropriate to their significance. So ensuring the building is in active use and fit for purpose without sacrificing the aspects that make it special. And so this is a really useful statistic here. So from 2022-2023, Bath and North East Somerset Council had a 95% consent rate for listed buildings. So that means that only 21 applications out of nearly 400 applications were either refused or withdrawn. So the message from this is that it is possible to achieve listed building consent. It just requires taking a measured approach to change and working with your local planning authority. Next slide, please. So I've got an example here of a recent consent for change of use and refurbishment to a Grade 2 building in Bath. So this is formerly the Newark Works, built in 1857 as heavy engineering works for Stothert and Pitt, so situated along the riverside. And this is sort of quite an important building relating to a firm that was critical for providing equipment that went into the development of the Great Western Railway and a lot of the industrialisation of Bath through the 19th century. And consent was granted in 2020 for the conversion of this building to create a new creative employment workspace as part of Bath's enterprise zone. The building was internally remodelled and modernised whilst retaining distinctive features. So you can see here on the right these fantastic exposed roof beams, as well as a crane hoist that had been left in the building originally, has been retained in place and suspended over what is now the central lobby. So it's about retaining these really distinctive features and sort of building and designing around it. And then we also had energy efficiency changes made as well for the installation of Crittall style slim profile double glazed windows. So you can see across this frontage here, whilst retaining 2 of the original windows. So it's a really great example of where a new use has been found for a previously vacant building whilst respecting and drawing upon its material characteristics and history. Next slide, please. So the requirements for listed building consent can seem complex, and your local planning authority can always provide further guidance if you're unsure as to what requires consent and what doesn't. Typically, any material alterations to a listed building will require consent, particularly for any structural changes or repairs. So this includes any works to the roof, such as roof repairs or resurfacing. Any alterations which would change the appearance or character will also require consent. So this could include external alterations such as painting, rendering works, stonework cleaning, as well as the replacement of windows or doors, or any works to boundary walls. But this also applies to interiors, so any changes to historic finishes or detailings, or alterations to internal layout. As well as sort of insertion of new ductwork and flues as well. Some works, such as the addition of an extension to the rear, for example, will require consent, but there may also be an additional requirement for planning permission. So it's also worthwhile bearing that in mind too. In terms of what doesn't need consent, general repairs and maintenance are required to keep the building in good condition and are typically acceptable. This also applies to any external maintenance of the associated sites. So if you've got sort of a garden or any land attached to the building as well. Internal and external redecoration works, typically in a like-for-like style, are acceptable. So this could include sort of repainting of windows in a like-for-like colour if the frontage has already been painted and has consent for that painting work. Repainting that to refinish the paint, it would be acceptable. And then new internal fittings such as carpet, soft furnishings and white goods can be installed, as well as sort of any minor electrical or plumbing repairs as well. So lots of things that can be done. Next slide, please. So this is a slightly denser slide, and we're looking a bit more in terms of what requirements there may be for specifically energy efficiency improvements. Typically, a lot of these will affect either building fabric, appearance or character and will therefore require consent. So alterations to windows and doors are one of the more common interventions. So for instance, installing more thermally efficient glazing, such as slim profile or vacuum glazing. This can be installing new glazing into existing sashes or entirely replacing the sashes with new. And in both cases, this will require consent. Consent will also be required for the installation of secondary glazing as well. So this includes separate sort of secondary glazing set within a separate frame within the internal window reveal, or lighter touch forms of secondary such as magnetic strip. In the case of draft proofing, listed building consent generally isn't required, so draft proofing windows and doors. Insulation applied internally or externally, so solid wall insulation, will need consent where there may be a change to the building's appearance, proportions of internal and external spaces, and implications for the performance of building fabric as well. So where there may be sort of a conflict in terms of how that wall is performing. Underfloor insulation will generally require consent if you need to lift the floor or remove a ceiling in order to enable insulation installation. Roof insulation typically doesn't require consent unless there would be any structural alterations to the roof itself. However, in the case of roof insulation, we still recommend that installation is undertaken by an experienced professional to ensure that appropriate levels of ventilation are managed around sort of like the roof eaves and to avoid any cold spots or thermal bridging. Moving on to micro renewables, so looking at things like roof-mounted solar PV. This will need listed building consent wherever this is installed on the roof. So even if we're talking about the inner roof valley of a historic M-shaped roof, that will still need consent. Where you're looking at ground-mounted PV, so set within the setting of a listed building, but not actually attached to the building, this may not require consent in some cases, but would need planning permission. So again, we're looking at sort of triggering a different sort of permission that is required. And as part of that application, any effect on the setting of a listed building would still be considered as well. And then moving on finally to things like heat pumps and mechanical ventilation systems as well. Generally, this will need consent for any new ductwork, pipework, or routing through historic fabric. There may also be a requirement if you're replacing boilers or radiators. Similarly, an air source heat pump will need consent and may also require planning permission in the conservation area. So as you can see, a lot of these works do trigger the need for consent, but then that then starts the process of working with the officer in terms of what can be done and how it can be done sensitively. So next slide, please. So moving on to this next section, we're now going to be looking at the listed building application process and how to submit an application. So next slide, please. So the process of submitting an application generally follows a three-stage process. This looks like quite a dense sort of schematic, but this is sort of taking into account the full scale of what could be done. And in some cases, this can be a lot simpler for smaller applications. So starting off, generally it's advised to reach out to your local planning authority for further guidance and to check consent is required. So there's a really easy duty service where you can get in contact with us through either phone or email, just to have that initial conversation and to confirm what the best step is for you. You can then apply for pre-app advice, which is sometimes recommended. This is not a compulsory service, but it is advised if you have any concerns about your application, and it's intended to provide further advice ahead of you submitting an application, so you're aware of any issues or any opportunities, or any further information that might be required as part of an application. And sort of the aim of the pre-app is to make applying for consent more straightforward. And as you can see, there is currently a trial service level 0 pre-app, which is specifically intended to offer advice on energy retrofit for listed buildings, which I'll go into in a bit more detail later on. What if you do choose to have a pre-app, you can then submit an application using the advice provided to you in the pre-app report. So if it recommends any minor changes made to your application, you can make those and then go ahead and submit your application. The decision process for an application is generally up to 16 weeks, but an extension can be agreed with the officer if any changes or revisions need to be made. So again, there's that open dialogue between case officer and applicant. And then moving on, in case your application should be refused, there are further avenues open to you moving through the system. So you can either withdraw and resubmit an application, making any relevant changes to address the reasons for refusal, or a refusal can be appealed by the applicant and referred to the planning inspectorate. And again, we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate that there is planning support available from your local planning authority if you're not sure what application you need or what sort of documents you need to be submitting. We're available to advise on when consent is required and what documentation to submit. So we can be contacted via phone or email, and the duty line is open on Tuesdays and Thursdays during the working week. And in certain cases, if an applicant wants specific advice on works, so if you already have a proposal in mind and you want really specific advice on it, we will recommend a pre-app, which takes us on to the next slide. So the pre-app allows for a more thorough assessment by the officer and provision of tailored advice in relation to your building specifically. So this can include a site visit, and sort of an opportunity to sit down with the officer and properly talk through what works you want to do and what opportunities are available. And then this will culminate in the issuing of a pre-app report. So this is basically a written out report which sets out the officer's position in relation to your scheme and gives an idea of what would be acceptable going forward into an application. There are different levels of pre-app advice depending on how complex your application is or the size of the site. So for instance, you can go to a really sort of high level pre-app if you're looking at lots of different buildings on the same site. And it will also, the idea of the pre-app is to set out what your next steps look like. So what the best route is going to be for you going forward. There may be opportunity for consultation with other departments where necessary. So if for instance, there are any ecological requirements, we can get in touch with the ecology department and get some feedback from them as well. It's a really good option ahead of submitting an application to gauge whether proposals are appropriate and what the likelihood of receiving consent is. The submission requirements, that there are some basic requirements for documentation, so things like a location plan so we can see where the site is, a really basic written overview of proposals, and generally site photographs are really helpful as well. If you have floor plans and elevations, it's really helpful to make these available because it allows the officer to make a more detailed judgment. And it's advised to provide evidence that an assessment of the building's heritage significance has gone ahead and been used to inform proposals. So again, referring back to what Joanna was talking about in more detail. Next slide, please. So just to quickly touch on our current pilot of the Service Level 0 pre-app, this is running as part of the Green Heritage Homes project and has been live for the last month or so. This is intended to be aimed exclusively at listed building homeowners, considering energy efficiency improvements to the listed buildings, but aren't sure what options are available. So this is a service which is intended to inform a potential retrofit project as early on as possible. At this stage, it's really simple, so you don't need any drawings or documents beyond completing the application form to let us know what measures you might be interested in, whether you've considered anything before, and a location plan is also helpful, so we can just see which site you're talking about as well. It's also worth flagging that this is also one of the cheaper services as well, because it's really early entry level and we want to make this as accessible as possible. So this is currently being offered for £66. Just to sort of kickstart that process and give you an opportunity to see what can be done. And then this service is being delivered in partnership with Bath and West Community Energy. So there are other options for homeowners who are interested in becoming a retrofit case study. You can sign up to become a listed building champion. So with that, you receive both the Level 0 pre-app, so the advice from the conservation officer, as well as a subsidised energy assessment. So this is quite a good option for anyone who's looking to get a little bit more involved. And there's further information about that on the council website. Next slide, please.
There we are, so there you're in.
So in terms of now submitting your listed building application, this is a free process, so there's no fee attached to submission, and it can be easily done online through the planning portal. It's worth noting that there may be costs, though, associated with the creation of architectural drawings or if you have hired a consultant to do the heritage assessment. The average timescale for a decision is 8 weeks, so this factors in the 3-week public consultation period where we can take any public comments. But you can agree on a deadline extension between with the officer if this is needed. It's also worth stating that from December 2023, so last year, there is now a planning guarantee in place of 16 weeks for non-major applications. Next slide, please. So to review what documents might be required as part of an application, so the national legislation does set out some basic requirements that submissions should include a location plan, an owner certificate, and any other plans, drawings, and information necessary to describe the development. So the local authority is effectively granted powers to request further documentation in compliance with their own standardised requirements. There may be some slight variations between local authorities, so always check with the authority that you're submitting to directly. In the case of Bath and North East Somerset Council, we have a checklist of requirements on our website, and this should be referred to when you're submitting an application. So I've got a summary here. So this does include a heritage statement or a heritage assessment when you're submitting a listed building application. Any existing and proposed scale elevations, floor plans, and where relevant, if you're looking at things like replacement windows where you're going into fine joinery detail, existing and proposing scale sections are really helpful and should be provided as well. A design and access statement is also essential and should be provided with a written summary of what works are proposed. And this, in some cases, depending on the scale of the application, this can be combined into the heritage statement. If there are any further documents required, these can be requested. So if there's a requirement for a structural survey, if you're undertaking any major structural works, any works to the roof might trigger a requirement for assessment of roosting bats. So there may be a requirement for an ecology survey. Again, this can all be really clearly communicated and made clearer to you as part of the application. It's worth noting as well, if you're applying for retrofit works, any keywords relating to your proposal, such as double glazing, should be included in the proposal description. Next slide, please. So once you have submitted your application, the planning services team will check through all documents and information before validating your application. And at this point when your application is validated, then you will be assigned an officer. An application will not be validated if the submission is incorrect, and this will slow down the process of your application. So there are several reasons why your application might be invalid. So for instance, if you have submitted the wrong type of application, if you've incorrectly filled in an application form or submitted the wrong form, you haven't paid the application fee, if there are any missing or incorrect drawings, if you've submitted the location plan, if the boundary line has been incorrectly drawn, so the boundary line needs to be up to date with what is your property and any land associated with that property to really make the ownership clear. And in the case of a listed building, any missing documents such as a heritage statement will mean that your application is invalid. Next slide, please. So you can make sure your application is valid by doing the following. So make sure you've selected the right application type. In some cases, proposals may require planning permission as well as listed building consent, so please do double check what the standard planning requirements are for works, such as any external alterations or extensions. Double check all of your submitted documents to make sure they're consistent and factually correct and do describe the works as proposed. The more detail you provide with your application, ultimately the better informed the case officer will be, which will be better for your application. Please make sure that your submission meets local requirements and you've provided all required drawings and documents, and you can check this against the checklist provided on the website. And lastly, again, further advice can be provided by the local planning authority if you have any concerns or questions. Next slide, please. And at this stage, it's just worth reiterating that the process of submitting and assessing a listed building application is a working partnership between the homeowner and the conservation officer, with the aim of working towards a scheme that may be granted consent. So the local plan does set out that the council will take a positive approach that reflects the presumption in favour of sustainable development. And the role of the officer is to work with the applicant to ensure proposals are compliant with local policy and will preserve and enhance the special architectural and historic interest of the listed building. Next slide, please. So should an application be granted consent, this will remain valid for up to 3 years after consent is granted. Once works are started in those 3 years, that expiry period will end, so that will be removed, and the application will remain valid. However, if works have not started 3 years up to 3 years after consent is granted, that consent will then expire. So if you want to then undertake the work set out in that previous consent, you will need to reapply. Consent may include conditions for certain details, so provision of material samples or drawings that will need to be provided before the works can start, and these conditions should be discharged by applying to the local authority before works begin. But all the conditions will set out what the sort of trigger requirement is in that condition bit of text. So be sure to sort of read through that and see when those need to be discharged. Where an application is refused, the reasons given for refusal are in accordance with national framework and legislation, and they'll be provided as part of the decision notice. If the application is resubmitted with no changes, the same reasons for refusal will still apply. A refusal can be appealed through the planning inspectorate, but the standard timeline for this is around 20 weeks, and it will come with additional costs. An application can be withdrawn, for instance, if an applicant doesn't want to progress the application, or if the officer indicates that they will be recommending a refusal. That then gives the chance to revise and resubmit that application, and will generally go back to the same officer to be reconsidered. And there are no additional fees associated with resubmitting after a withdrawal for a listed building application. Next slide, please. So once an application is submitted, it will then be assessed and a decision made by the case officer in line with local and national planning policy. So in this last section, we will be breaking down the decision-making process, including an introduction to relevant policy. Next slide, please. So there are several key elements of national policy that are used to inform planning policy and decision making, and will therefore be referred to by the local planning authority. So going back to the Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act 1990, which is responsible for designation and management of listed buildings and conservation areas. This sets out special controls for demolition, alteration or extension works. More importantly, the NPPF, or in terms of the practice of making a planning decision, the NPPF is the key document we go to as the adopted framework of the government's planning policies for England, and it must be considered by the local planning authority when preparing our own development plan. And it also functions, it also has a material consideration in planning decisions. It's also worth noting that certain works may need planning permission as well as listed building consents. So the General Permitted Development Order 2015 will set out what permitted development rights are and what constitutes permitted development. And this should be referred to if you're submitting an application, you're not sure whether you need to go for planning permission as well. The government has put together a simplified guide for homeowners, so it sort of strips out some of the more complicated bits from the order itself and makes it a bit more readable, and that's a really helpful tool that's available for free online, so I'd recommend having a look at that. Next slide, please. So national legislation sets out the local authority's legal duty to have special regard to the desirability of preserving the building or its setting or any features of special or architectural interest. Next slide, please. And similarly, this also applies to conservation areas. So there is also a duty to pay special attention to the desirability of preserving or enhancing the character or appearance of a conservation area where a planning application may affect that area. So this section does encompass a broader range of planning applications outside of listed building consent. However, where a listed building is set within a conservation area, this will remain a relevant consideration that may factor into a planning decision as part of your consent. So it's just worth bearing in mind. Next slide, please. Looking at the NPPF, this states that local planning authorities should take account of the desirability of sustaining and enhancing the significance of heritage assets and putting them to viable uses consistent with their conservation. This does include the positive contribution that heritage assets make to communities, and development is also expected to make a positive contribution to local character and distinctiveness. Next slide, please. It's worth noting as well that the NPPF was recently updated in December 2023, which included a number of changes to the planning approach to housing delivery, plan making, and the use of design codes to inform new development. The framework was also updated in relation to the weight attributed to energy efficiency changes in planning decisions. So local planning authorities should now give significant weight to the need to support energy efficiency and low carbon heating improvements to existing buildings, though relevant consideration should still be given to the policy set out in relation to the historic environment. So therefore, this is basically highlighting the retrofit should be attributed greater weight as part of the planning balance. Next slide, please. So moving on to look at local policy, this sets out the specific guidance for development within the district whilst being compliant with the NPPF. So this is generally set out in the Bath and North East Somerset Council Development Plan, which includes the local plan. Ongoing changes are being made to the local plan to either update existing policy or add new policy. So the most up-to-date version at the moment is the partial update, which was adopted in January 2023. There is a new upcoming version of the local plan which was released this year for public consultation. So when this eventually comes through and is adopted, this will replace the existing plan. The local plan is also supported by adopted supplementary planning documents, or SPDs, which provide additional guidance to support policy, and these can be a material consideration in planning decisions. So several relevant SPDs when looking at energy efficiency for listed buildings may include the conservation area character appraisals, which set out a really in-depth assessment of the conservation area, the historic environment, any key listed buildings in that area, as well as the energy efficiency, retrofitting and sustainable construction SPD, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail later on. Adopted neighbourhood plans are also really useful guidance for local areas and communities, which can set out the adopted vision for a neighbourhood, including an assessment of the historic environment, so a really useful resource. And again, if we're talking about potential requirement for planning permission, please note that there are Article 4 directions implemented in certain areas, which remove permitted development rights and may therefore trigger the requirement for planning permission. All Article 4 directions are available on the council website, so I'd advise it's helpful to have a quick look at those. Next slide, please. So there are a number of local policies that may be specifically relevant to your application, and it's worth noting that all local policy aligns with the general principles set out in the NPPF. So the key policy for listed buildings is policy HE1 for historic environments, and policy B4 is also useful and is relevant where the listed building might make a notable contribution to the World Heritage Site and its setting. There are general design policies such as policies D1, D2 and D3, which cover relevant factors such as urban design principles, local character and distinctiveness and urban fabric. And then when we're talking about energy retrofit, policy CP1 is the key policy to consider here. Next slide, please. So going into these in a little bit more detail, in accordance with policy HE1, great weight should be given to the conservation of the district's heritage asset, and any harm to the significance of a designated or non-designated heritage asset must be justified. Policy B4 sets out a strong presumption against development that would result in harm to the outstanding universal value of the World Heritage Site. In accordance with local policy, retrofitting measures to existing buildings to improve energy efficiency will be encouraged. In the case of listed buildings, an application would need to be compliant with both policies HE1 and CP1. So any proposals would need to propose energy efficiency improvements that would not result in unjustified harm to the building's significance. So it's meeting all of these local policies at the same time. Next slide, please. So touch briefly on this SPD that was published by Bath and North East Somerset Council. So this is really useful because it sets out further guidance on certain retrofitting measures, as well as setting out council positions on what types of measures are considered to be appropriate and what approach to a certain measure might be recommended. So this SPD is adopted as part of local policy and is therefore a really useful resource to consider in relation to what types of retrofit might be compliant with local policy and therefore likely to receive consent. Next slide, please. So understanding the significance of a heritage asset and its setting from a very early stage in the design process can help to inform the development of proposals which avoid or minimise harm, and this is something that Joanna covered in a lot more detail. This should be demonstrated by an applicant as part of their heritage assessment or heritage statement. So assessment as early on as possible can help to identify the building's constraints or opportunities and inform how those proposals are developed. And this can help to identify alternatives such as more sensitive designs that will achieve a more appropriate balance of conserving the heritage asset and the delivery of public benefits. The assessment of significance should be proportionate to the importance of the asset and the works proposed. So in some cases, a heritage statement might go into more detail than others. In some areas, a short statement might be sufficient where works are of a much smaller scale or restricted to a certain part of the building. Next slide, please. It is the duty of the decision maker to assess whether a proposal might cause harm to a heritage asset and what that level of harm is. So the NPPF sets out that a great weight should be given to the asset's conservation, irrespective of whether any potential harm amounts to substantial harm, total loss, or less than substantial harm. Any harm or loss of significance should require clear and convincing justification, and that may include demonstration of sufficient public benefit to outweigh that level of harm. Next slide, please. So what constitutes harm? This is typically assessed on a sliding scale, varying from less than substantial to substantial harm at sort of the both ends. The grading of harm allows for a much more nuanced assessment. So for instance, works may be found at the lower end of less than substantial harm, so right at the bottom of the scale, which is the lowest level of harm available. However, when we're looking at the NPPF, it's a little bit more polarised, and there are two different set approaches for either less than substantial or substantial harm, which we'll look at in the next slide. Oh, no, but there should be another slide on harm there. Okay, well, I'll cover it verbally anyway. So where harm is identified as less than substantial, this harm should be weighed against the public benefits of the proposal, including where appropriate, securing its optimum viable use. So this may be the most viable use for the building owner, as well as the future conservation of the asset. So if the building is already in use or occupied, it could be argued that its optimum viable use has already been secured in this case. Substantial harm is attributed differently to grade 2 buildings and grade 2 star and grade 1 buildings. So substantial harm to a grade 2 building should be exceptional and should be demonstrated to be necessary to achieve substantial public benefit, or if the proposed development meets criteria as set out in the NPPF. But a planning decision is ultimately made based on an objective balancing exercise known as the planning balance. So the officer will consider the balance of assessed harm versus identified public benefits, in which the benefits should outweigh the harm. Harm may constitute harm to the building itself, such as loss of historic fabric or significance, or its setting, and may also include insufficient documentation or justification of works. Public benefit is loosely characterised as anything that delivers economic, social, or environmental objectives in accordance with national policy. Public benefit should not be a private benefit. However, benefits don't have to be visible or accessible to the public in order to be genuine public benefits. So an example of a public benefit that might not be publicly experienced would be the heritage benefits associated with removing or reducing risk to a heritage asset, securing its optimum viable use and long-term conservation, or enhancing its significance or the contribution of its setting. And as outlined previously, great weight should also be given to energy efficiency improvements as a public benefit. Next slide, please. There's my harm slide, no worries. Next slide, please. Lovely. So now we're moving on to the last few slides, just briefly covering the case study. So this is an example of a listed building that was granted consent for retrofit works for the replacement of all windows across the front and rear elevations with slim profile double glazed sash windows. So the building itself is a grade 2 terraced townhouse on Lansdowne Place East, and is also situated within the Bath Conservation Area and World Heritage Sites. Next slide, please. So the application was submitted with a site plan and photographs of the front and rear to be able to show what the building looks like. It was submitted with a merged design and access statement and heritage statement, and the level of detail in that was proportionate to the scope of works, where works were proposed to the windows only, and there was clear evidence that these were late 20th century additions and therefore of no historic value. We also had provided existing and proposed elevations as well as clear high detail window details and sections to really see sort of the changes to, for instance, the glazing bars and the sash frames. So following engagement with the case officer, we did have revised proposals submitted. These proposed things such as removing the timber sills from the replacement window design where this isn't typically used in this area, as well as amending the fenestration at dormer level to a 3/6 to reflect the reduced size of the window openings. And the glazing bar profile was amended to a more sympathetic Avolo profile to reflect better the character of the area. So next slide, please. Oh, sorry, next slide, please. Oh, lovely, yeah. So as part of the decision, the case officer concluded that the retention of single glazing would not be necessary to the significance of the listed building, where the windows as existing were replaced as part of major post-war reconstruction works and were in poor condition. The proposed slight increase in glazing bar profile was considered acceptable given the history of the building and the proposed benefits of the energy efficiency improvements, and was found to be in line with local authority guidance. We've covered this case study in a bit more detail in some of the videos we've put together. So we'll just play a little bit of that for you now.
A third option, in some cases where windows are not original, can be replacement of whole windows or existing window panes with slim profile double glazing. This can reduce heat loss by around half compared to single glazing.
So what we're looking at here is a slim light double glazed sash window that's been installed into a grade 2 listed building.
So a single glazed panel has a very high energy loss associated with it. So if the outside temperature is sort of -5 degrees and it's 20 degrees in here, the surface temperature of the actual glass could be about 2 degrees. So one would feel that cold. Even a slim light panel such as this, if the surface temperature would be nearer 16 degrees. So that's a huge difference in terms of your appreciation of comfort, as well as the energy loss.
So this application was granted consent because what was here originally were not original to the building. So what we had were sash windows that had been installed in the 1970s, so post bomb damage. So there was no historic joinery remaining at all, and there was a really good opportunity here to install something that would improve the thermal efficiency of the building, whilst replicating all these traditional details and finishes that would be consistent with the appearance of the building. So with the design of the windows as originally submitted, there was some negotiation in terms of the design. So what we see here, the glazing bars are of a slightly different profile, drawn from existing examples through the house, so from doors and internal glazing panels, and they're actually 3 mil deeper than originally proposed. So it's all about working with the applicant, between the applicant and the case officer, to find the best solution that is ultimately going to be installed. Lovely, thanks, Sarah. Lovely. So to round off in the conclusion, it is possible to sensitively adapt and alter listed buildings to make them fit for use, whilst at the same time preserving and enhancing their special interest. The listed building application process does require a more nuanced and engaging approach, but this will ultimately result in a better quality proposal. There is still a common assumption that listed building consent is impossible to secure for improvements such as energy efficiency, but this is not the case. And with the declaration of the climate and ecological emergencies, there is a more urgent need than ever to future-proof our listed buildings and make them more sustainable and fit for use homes. The importance of retrofitting existing buildings, and listed buildings in particular, is increasingly being recognised on a national level, resulting in recognition of improvements as a public benefit in planning decisions. So realistically, if there is a time to retrofit your listed building, it is now. And if we move on to the last slide. So I thought I'd just sort of quickly round up everything that we've covered, because I know we've been on a bit of a whirlwind tour. So what's next for you after this session? So really we're sort of looking at finding out a bit more about your building and its listing and its history. So Historic England's a really great place to start for this, to give you sort of a basic understanding, to sort of help identify its significance, and using all those resources that Joanna has pulled out. And then moving on to developing a comprehensive heritage assessment to then put together your initial proposals whilst balancing the need to sustain significance. At this stage, you can then reach out to your local planning authority for further guidance and support, and then finally submit your planning application. Thank you.